Okay, everyone, I'm going to open this London Climate Action Week event, one of many events being hosted here during London Climate Action Week. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about the future of sustainable finance in an unstable world. And I am going to introduce our excellent speakers, and then I will introduce the session and what we're going to talk about. So this afternoon, we are all looking forward to hearing from Mona Ali, who's an associate professor of economics at the State University of New York. Interestingly, working on a book on the weaponization of global finance. Kerry Krasinski, Yale, and Brown University, but also co-founder, very importantly for us, of the Sustainable Finance Institute. I'm delighted to have my colleague, Franklin Staves from E3G. He's working with us on sustainable finance, but also has a background at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And finally, our good friend and colleague, Soni Kapoor, who's the managing director of NIFTIS, the Nordic Institute for Finance, Technology, Sustainability and Society, but also, as of relatively recently, professor of climate, geoeconomics and finance at the European University Institute. So I think it's an excellent group of people. We're going to talk about sustainable finance, given some of the not just the immediate uncertainties, but actually a kind of a chain of uncertainties that we've seen in recent years. I guess the immediate impetus is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and where we have seen this huge, unprecedented set of financial and trade sanctions, not just on a small little country, but on a major energy and commodity exporting country, a major piece of the global market. So shockwaves throughout financial markets and supply chains, and almost regardless of how the dreadful conflict ends, we are going to see the implications of this for quite some time. So, but it's not just Europe diversifying from oil and gas and Russia trying to shift its exports elsewhere. Within this, we're seeing that diverted exports from Russia being effectively de-dollarized. Supports the ruble, I guess, but it also insulates economies from the risk of secondary sanctions that might happen. But it's not as if this is coming on top of a perfectly calm and happily operating world. We've already seen that the European strategic open autonomy, COVID-induced worries about where stuff gets produced and that. When you think of the implications of now adding to that, the implications for access to technology, the decisions of major firms, things are changing. It could be a big shift. And in the meantime, climate politics organization like E3G, working in the context of London Climate Action Week, we think this is a crucial decade for climate investment. We think it's really important that economic actors are able to cooperate to ensure finance moves to where it's needed for transition. Well, it looks a lot more uncertain, certainly in the short to medium term, but the potential fragmentation could have implications that are geopolitical in terms of the availability of finance, the composition of finance. It's going to affect developed countries, surely, but of course, developing economies are massively at risk of losing. However, the present conflict and the sanction implications and everything else work out. So that's what we're thinking about in terms of climate. That's why we have got this august panel to discuss it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass along to the next person speaking, which is you, Mona. Delighted to hear from you in this context and from everybody else. People, attendees, please add your questions or comments to the Q&A that you should have access to. I really attach a lot of importance to hearing your comments, your thoughts, and to putting your questions to this panel. So thank you all. I will step back. Over to you, Mona.
Thank you, Ronan. I'm very happy to be here and to engage in a conversation with our other august panelists, as you mentioned, Ronan. I think I'm going to start by situating ourselves and then move on perhaps later. And maybe in the chat, you could tell me when 5 minutes is up. And I'll transition later to talking about what needs to be done in terms of stabilizing finance. But I just want to make sure we are all on the same page with regard to weaponization and what it means for the climate framework. So I want to start with this understanding that this is a moment fraught with peril, but also possibility. And we don't know which way the die are going to fall. We've seen over the last 4 months with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the weaponization of the global financial architecture. And here I want to be very clear about what we mean by weaponization. It's the use of global trade and financial infrastructures to conduct state objectives, particularly foreign policy. So it started with the G7, the group of 7 nations, seizing Russia's central bank reserves held offshore. These are dollar-denominated and euro-denominated reserves. It moved on to a whole host of other sanctions, including export bans on Russian exports, import bans on Russian exports by the G7. Originally, oil and gas was excluded from that first ban, but now, over the last month or two, it's been included. So there's a total ban on Russian oil and gas coming into the US. These sanctions, right, on Russia are meant to really kill the Russian economy, and they've backfired in a way because we have counter sanctions being imposed by Russia. So Russia, for instance, has reduced its gas inflowing through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline to Germany. So it's just 60% of Russian gas now flowing through the Nord Stream pipeline. So Europe is seeing a real energy squeeze. It's going to get worse in the winter. And there are issues around storage of gasoline that's coming in right now. So we're dealing with the weaponization of the global financial system. And in light of that, sanctions and counter sanctions, the emergence of 2 distinct energy and economic blocs, NATO and the BRICS. And this new Cold War that we're in threatens to escalate into a hot war down the road, perhaps in the Indo-Pacific. I want to have us think about how weaponization has propelled a new climate framework that, in fact, has certain productive aspects. So the new climate framework, and I think it's very clear post NATO's meeting, day 1 yesterday, is one in which national security, energy security, and economic security come together, right, in a new climate framework embraced by at least the G7, the G20. And this is what it's going to look like. Energy security may finally push the green transitions if states back it, which the US and certainly Europe has done. We're going to see a decarbonization, an acceleration of decarbonization in Europe in the quest for energy independence, given this new energy security umbrella that we're all under. The United States will expand its LNG market to Europe. And in the meantime, though, we're probably going to see a maxing out of oil and gas to as we kick out a major oil producer, Russia. Where's the oil going to come from? Where's the gas going to come from until we have the new infrastructure, the green infrastructure? So what we're seeing right now is some disturbing trends where there's a kickoff in CapEx spending, capital expenditure spending in the US and Canada and in Europe to meet the short and medium term shortages of oil and gas. I want to step back and think about the security climate framework. NATO yesterday pledged that climate is part of its strategic concept, so its agenda for the next 10 years. I think that is significant. It comes at the heels of the Bonn summit, where the new finance facility for loss and damage was actually left off the table because of pushback by wealthy nations. So we're going to see the split between the rich and the poor part of the global economy. So I want to talk a little bit about that right now. So in the crosshairs of this weaponization of the climate agenda, I think lie the climate futures of low income economies and even middle income countries that are experiencing a triple whammy of a debt crisis, a climate infrastructure crisis, and a food and fuel crisis. And so what's happened that's productive, though, is this understanding that climate and debt are explicitly connected, right? And where this goes is a little bit uncertain. In the US itself, the Build Back Better program is really the window of implementing that by Congress, needs to pass that, is coming to an end. Just yesterday, 100 million, which is really not enough. We were looking at 1.5 trillion for the Build Back Better plan, but 100 million has been secured by Congress, and that's going to be hopefully used by ARPA-E, which is the research wing of the Department of Energy. So a bit of money for green infrastructure in the US, but not enough. And so I think the real, and I think I'm going to end here, the real issue is this timing, because we know, right, that the costs of transition, the financing costs, are going to escalate as interest rates are rising. And more will be required the longer we wait. So where does the financing from the infrastructure come right now? And that is really in peril. Nothing has been delivered so far. There is a lot of unused capital at the IFIs, the international financial institutions, which, and we can talk about the SDR issuance, 650 billion newly issued through the IMF, and 550 billion is still in the reserves of rich countries at the IMF. Now that 550 billion could be channeled to developing countries. It hasn't been as yet. So the money is there, both public as well as private finance, but it needs to be channeled to the global South. My real fear is that we're going to encounter a new world, a brave new world, if you will, of militarized climate politics, where Europe, the United States are going to successfully, in the United States case, through the Department of Defense Production Act, the DPA, they're going to be able to implement a pretty ambitious climate agenda. But what's going to be left in the crosshairs of that are the climate futures of the poorer parts of the global South. I do think I'm out of time, so I'll stop. I do have more to say, but I will save that for later.
You were ever so slightly out of time. It was so worthwhile capturing those last thoughts. So I really do appreciate that. I am going to go straight to you next, Carrie, and hear from you.
And thanks for having me so much. And great to follow Mona's thoughtful comments. I would concur that there's a clear capital gap, actually, for the transition that we need to see happen. And we're not focusing nearly enough on how to create that capital, how to steer that capital where it's needed. Somehow we're at square one when it comes to what we really need to do. I think we've been, I don't want to say hijacked by phrases and terminology, acronyms like GCF. We really need to start over, since we're not even agreeing on what we're trying to do here. For example, it wasn't that long ago that the U.S., or I teach, write, and advise here in the U.S. at institutions such as Yale, where I teach an energy studies class, and it wasn't more than a year or two ago that tens of thousands of oil and gas engineers were likely to be laid off because the climate paradigm meant that there was going to be no need for their work, and hence the oil and gas industry had not been as active, leading up to the invasion of Ukraine. And so now the White House is scrambling to get the refineries back in operation because of the supply and demand side of the climate challenge. We put so much emphasis on oil and gas sourcing, whereas something like 85% of annual carbon emissions come from the demand side of fossil fuel use. I don't know why we're not focusing more on that. It's the 80-20 rule and then some. And the shifts in the price of oil. Well, it wasn't long ago that a barrel of oil was trading for $. You could have just stashed it in your backyard and made tons of money. Not that would have been a very good idea. But so we don't seem to be focused on the global agenda for what's needed. It's shocking that we're still having this conversation here in June 2022. And to what degree was this a factor in Vladimir Putin's thinking? Would it shock any of us to think that climate was part of the equation here? In fact, there's an excellent book out of Georgetown called Climate, K-L-I-M-A-T, which talked about, right before the invasion of Ukraine, the major challenge to the Russian economy when it comes to where we were going on climate. So I'd have a hard time believing that these things are somehow disconnected and perhaps even intentional. Would it shock us? And so I think we need to spend a lot more time on what's really needed from investment. How are we going to raise this capital, this 50 trillion over 20 years that we're 3 to 5 times under invested in? The capital won't magically appear. I'm pretty close to a whole bunch of global asset owners, as I know my fellow panelists are. They just don't have money sitting around on the sidelines, and development banks can only do so much. So I'm encouraged by groups like E3G, think out of the box, try to bring people together, because I think that's what's needed. I think we definitely need to open up this conversation, not lose the Russian people in the process, or the Chinese people, or the Iranian people, or the Indian people, who are all perhaps as countries not doing enough on climate, but there are plenty of people like us who also want to see progress made. And people are the most important part of this dimension. 2/3 of the global footprint are people and the choices they make. Politicians who can put policy in place are voted in or not based on what people think. And we're not resonating with our conversations with the so-called average person. I have to watch my terminology. Are corporations doing enough? To what degree is that important versus investment or policy or innovation, where there's tons happening? The climate tech VC space, where I had a hand in starting the very popular free newsletter, is all guns blazing. No stopping innovation. And so we need to kind of maximize corporate activity, investment activity, but we also need to kind of build these new coalitions of the willing and not leave people behind, and not go for the us and them approach that we seem to be taking, frankly, out of the G7. We need to welcome everyone. We need to make excuse me, we need to make sure we recognize the rise of the ASEAN region and how important they'll be to this dimension, and stop having purely Western conversations. And I'm hoping to work on helping fill this capital gap in new creative ways, because the money's just not there actually for these many trillions of dollars that need to be redeployed. And completely agree with Mona on the need for addressing the global South. I'll leave my comments there. There's a lot happening in education in China and the work we do. I'd welcome everyone's questions, and especially the comments of my following panelists as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Perry. And we're definitely going to come back to you on many of those. The idea that the money is not there is a very strong message that we do need to get across. I will turn to you next, Franklin, to hear your perspective on this.
Thank you very much, Ronan. And I hope I want to sort of take a step back and start out with a kind of broad macro historical perspective, which I hope will be a nice bridge between Kerry's points there, particularly at the end, and Soni's comments coming up, and particularly reflecting about the role of the global South. at this junction. So there are 3 points that I think are crucial here, and that speak directly to the unstable world part of the title of this panel. First, in my opinion, there can be absolutely no doubt that we are at an historical inflection point. As much as some people might like to sketch pathways or strategies to facilitate a return to the status quo ante, and I wouldn't necessarily count myself out of that group, I'm afraid that we are cursed to live in interesting times, certainly for the foreseeable future and possibly for the next decade. The pace and the scope of the tectonic changes that we've seen since the 24th of February have been, at least to me, truly bewildering. And I was reminded of Lenin's quote when describing the revolutionary moment of the early 1920s, that there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And certainly it feels like for most of the 90s and the 2000s and the teens, not a great deal was really happening. And in the last 4 months, decades of political and economic change has already occurred. So in my opinion, this inflection point is, of course, at its core geopolitical in nature. The de facto expulsion of Russia, which of course is the world's largest nuclear superpower, and one of the world's most important suppliers of both energy and commodities to global markets, from almost all key institutions of the international rules-based order, including vital parts of the international financial system, is truly unprecedented, certainly in our lifetimes. And the parallel and simultaneous diminution of both the salience and the authority of the United Nations as the preeminent multilateral rules-based institution is just one hallmark of this historical inflection point. Well, of course, geopolitics and war have been the main drivers of this historical inflection point. It is also intrinsically and inherently political in nature. It entails dramatic shifts in the foreign and security policies across the developed world and parts of the South, including obviously the reinvigoration and expansion of NATO, and highly likely further expansion of the EU to include Moldova and Ukraine in the foreseeable future. But it's also brought to the foreground the long simmering underlying conflict between liberal democratic market economies on the one hand and autocratic state-led capitalism on the other. And in my view, these geopolitical axes are only going to grow more distinct and more polarized over time. So these twin shifts in hard power politics on the one hand, and in the what we might call ideological or even possibly instrumental conflict between two very different conceptions of political governance, will reverberate through our politics for decades and will really define the world that we live through. The second point is that, to me at least, it's still profoundly unclear what impact these geopolitical shifts and political shifts will have on the global economy, in particular on global trade and on transnational capital flows. And importantly, what modalities the global economy will function through in the future, i.e. whether the norms, rules, and institutions established in the post-war era and built out in the post-Cold War decade of rapidly accelerated globalization will continue to hold. And of course, if they don't hold, what type of system will replace them? Third, and perhaps most importantly, the significance of this cannot be stressed enough. For perhaps the first time in modern history, it will not be the developed North that will decide the answer to these questions about the nature of the global economy and the international financial system, at least not the North alone. The global South, particularly the largest markets, this is picking up on Carrie's point, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, the Philippines, Egypt, will also have a powerful and centering role in either preserving or tearing down the rules-based international economic order. And it's unclear, at least to me, whether those countries' interests will best be served by stabilizing the macroeconomic ship and the macrofinancial ship, or by pushing to replace the existing norms and institutions with a new set of rules which better meet their development and growth priorities in the decade ahead. So I hope that's a nice segue into Sony's comments, and look forward very much to the discussion.
Thank you, Franklin. Excellent. 3 excellent points there. Sony, over to you to pick up from that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the excellent comments. And let me start with the point that Carrie made about energy. There's been a lot of discussion recently that some economies appear to have decoupled from broken the link between GDP growth and energy consumption. But I think those comments have been sort of widely misinterpreted because in many of those cases, those have occurred at very high levels of income that very few countries have attained. And for the most part, this doesn't apply to the vast majority of the world's population, right? So the near foreseeable economic pathway for the world will continue to see a very tight link between GDP growth and energy consumption, and there are no two ways around it. So I think that is fact number one I wanted to start with. Second is that that energy has always, and I think we most of us are sort of relatively youngish, right? And I think we haven't seen the worst of energy politics and energy conflict, right? But the entire involvement of the United States in the Middle East, the very fraught politics of the Middle East, for example, it's all intimately related to energy. And we remember at least reading about, I was very, very young then, but the upheavals that the last oil embargoes caused, and the shifts they caused across global institutions, political alliances, in terms of military alliances. And of course, they were responsible for creating the euro-dollar market, which is one of the bedrocks of the international financial system. So they had very wide-ranging impacts. And so I think that's the second important thing to remember, that energy has always been central, both to growth and to the international order, both economic and governance, but also, of course, military. And this time is no different in that sense. Number three, at some point in the energy discussion, climate became, if not the dominant driver, it became one of the major drivers. And there's no two ways around the fact that I think, again, Carrie alluded to, which was the narrative, the dominant narrative until 2021, which really, really picked up speed, during the COVID crisis, was that, ESG was going to rule the world. Oil and gas was a sunset industry. Coal was already passé. The future all belonged to renewables. The cost of capital was falling down, and the transition was really, really picking up speed. And if you're a parent who allowed your child to go into, petroleum engineering, etc., that would perhaps worse than, wrapping them over the knuckles or corporal punishment of other kinds, right? I mean, and that narrative, it's too soon to say whether that narrative was entirely wrong, but it was definitely premature. And I think one way of thinking about what has happened with the Russian invasion is, the world was sort of getting a bit cocky about the transition. And this is Russia sort of splashing cold water in our face and slapping us around and saying, hey, wake up, this is how the real world works. And I think Franklin or somebody alluded to a potential link between climate and Russia's decision to invade and the timing of it. And I have some access to, some intelligence from within Russia, not necessarily top level, not that accurate, perhaps, but it seems intuitively right that, if you were Putin and the oil markets were in the state they were last year, and somebody mentioned the oil price actually turning negative, right? It was now or never, right? It was the last hurrah. I mean, Russia has failed to build a diversified economy. It is a primary economy pretending to be a developed economy, right? I mean, it is at best sort of belongs to the second world, second tier economic status, not, if not the developing status. And if not now, then when? This was the last hurrah. The timing was I think, impeccable. Just as energy demand was picking up, the economic growth was really, really rebounding unexpectedly. It was the best time to strike. And of course, when Putin stuck, it was sort of impossible, both morally and politically impossible, for the EU and the United States not to act, as they sort of failed to the last time Russia invaded Ukraine. And, we're all paying the price for that. So what could they do that wouldn't end up potentially escalating into, a nuclear war or, conflict between nuclear armed states? And in that sense, financial and economic sanctions were sort of the only toolkit they had. And right or wrong, and I know, folks speak about the weaponization of the global financial and trading regime. But if you put yourself in the shoes of EU policymakers, if you put yourself in the shoes of countries really, really wanting to signal enough is enough to Russia, and to defend Ukraine and support heroism that has been demonstrated repeatedly from within Ukraine, there was precious little else we could do in the West apart from really, really bringing out the whole toolkit that has been used before, mostly after legitimization by the UN Security Council in North Korea and Iran, right? And I think this is the big difference. There was no way that Russia was not going to veto sanctions against itself at the Security Council. So it made absolutely no sense to go to the UN and seek any sort of authorization. And I think maybe too much is being made out of that, because that was just a non-starter. So if you put on your EU policymaker American hat and you find yourself in this situation, I mean, what else was there to do? And in fact, I did actually work on the sanctions myself. So that having been said, what has been really problematic is the tone, and I think it was captured well by the Indian foreign minister, who said, when Europe faces a problem, it assumes it's the world's problems. But when the world faces a problem, it's not Europe's problem. And the tone deafness of some of the comments, for example, the EU or European leaders, talking down at the Indians, asking them to not buy Russian oil, while they've been, pumping record amounts of euros through record amount of Russian oil and gas purchases. And the oil embargo is not to take effect until, another 6 months or so. I mean, that is where, so one is the actual actions themselves. And I think those in many cases are far more defensible. And, sensible people in India, in China, in Brazil, in the large, consequential states you mentioned, they understand what needed to be done and that this needed to be done. But it's the tone and the way it has been sort of missold and making this a global war. You're either with us or against us. I mean, those are the sorts of things where we can really, really lose allies, and where the frictions can turn into fractures in global finance, global governance, and global trade. And that is what we must avoid at all consequences. Now, that having been said, let me just try and conclude. So most of my work nowadays lies at the nexus between climate, global finance, macroeconomics, and international development. And of course, none of this can be done outside of geopolitics. And here, let me conclude with the following thought. So one is the distinction between stock and flow. Now, from a stock perspective, the West mostly holds all of the cards. We have the fantastic stock of trillions of dollars of financial assets. We've got fantastic infrastructure. We still dominate technologically, including in the technological solutions, with the green transition, etc. But it's very, very clear that the flow, and with every single year, and particularly contributions to global growth, they come increasingly and will accelerate from emerging economies that are not part of the G7 or the European Union. And that has not been recognized. The second thing to remember in the climate context is, while the EU may be globally, systemically significant from a financial and a trading and an economic perspective, we are not systemically significant from a climate perspective. The future of whether climate will be mitigated or not will be decided mostly in what you guys call the global south, and the decisions taken there or not taken there. And so for our collective future, whether it is to avoid 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, the only thing that makes sense is to pair up our strengths, which is finance, technology, knowledge, with the needs of the developing and the emerging world, which will need large amounts of technological transfer, huge amounts of financial support, as well as a developmental model that will need to look different from the one that China, Korea, Japan, and all other countries that have industrialized followed before them, every single one of which had a very large environmental footprint that the world has run out of environmental space to allow a large country like India to use. So it needs to be a different development model, a different trading strategy, a different financial model. And that is the only sensible, macroeconomically feasible way forward. Nothing else makes sense.
Sonny, thank you very much for bringing us back there to this question of how we take the transition forward. But also in so doing, reminding us yet again in a different way to the way others reminded us of a kind of what is the nature of the North-South split here. So I'm going to ask a few questions of you, but can I remind everybody to please watch that chat, ask questions in the chat or the Q&A. And there is already an interesting question in there on reflections on exactly what the war means for transition, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. But I just want to see if I could probe a little some of the points that people have been making. And I think the first thing to observe is this question of the split. That is, are not just the split, the emergent splits that people have spoken about. Franklin, you particularly talked about there's kind of a north-south split. There is a excuse me. There is a difference, if you like, in terms between the so-called liberal democracies and the people with other approaches to governance out there. So can I come back to people? And first, what is your sense of the profundity of the nature of this split? Is this one that's fixed, or can it be repaired? Is there an easy repair model? Is it something that might be true about weapons and kind of positions that one takes in the UN, but would the world not agree that a public good like decarbonizing the atmosphere is something we should all come together around? So I'm very much, who would like to come back on that one to me? Just speak, colleagues. Mona.
All right. So I do want to push back on a couple of things, but I'll wait for that. In terms of the split, I think, I was thinking about how to characterize it. I mean, one of the ways of thinking about it is North versus South. Sonny, you've indicated some critique you might have of that concept. one of the things I was thinking about, there's a clear split, this emerging, energy and economic bloc between the NATO countries, right, which is a transatlantic alliance, mostly Western Europe and the United States, and the BRICS. And we are seeing expansion, right, of the membership of both the NATO, which one associates with the global north, as well as the BRICS, right, Brazil, Russia, India, China, expanding to a larger alliance. And so that's the pushback that this new weaponization has produced, right? I like the point, Sunny, that you made about frictions in the global economy. And I think one of the friction that we should attune ourselves to is, as Sunny mentioned, I've written about this as well, about those who dominate global finance, which is the global north, which is the United States and Europe, are no longer the producers of the bulk of world GDP. About 60% of world GDP is produced in developing countries, right? And so that is a clear tension within the global economy, one that has become explosive. The pushback, I want to just refer to that briefly. I don't think we have time to create a new world order. I feel that is a wasted conversation, if I might be so blunt. I think we recognize, all of us, that we have 10 years or less, right, to avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius and over. So how do we get there, right? We have to unite the coalition of the willing with the coalition of the rest. And that political settlement is necessary. And that involves a de-weaponization of the global financial system. I would suggest de-weaponizing the dollar by removing sanctions on Russia. And I know that's a very controversial point, but I'm one of those progressive economists who truly mourn globalization as we knew it. We aren't going to see it return, right? But I worry there's incredible worry on my part about how this new world order will look like. And I don't want to get into blaming Russia, because one can also talk about the history of NATO and NATO enlargement. That's a separate conversation. We can stick to the climate, security debt net.
May I come in there?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think, right? I mean, so there is a lot of talk of the weaponization of the dollar and the fracturing of the global financial system and so on, right? But frankly, I mean, there isn't much evidence yet, right? And may I just remind everybody here, BRICS sounds like a nice acronym, right? Which didn't really go anywhere. And there's the BRICS Bank, and now there's BRICS Plus. But I'm in New Delhi right now, and China is no friend of India, right? I mean, we are part of the same acronym, right? I mean, there's the BRICS Bank, but India lives in existential dread of Chinese expansionism, Chinese, accumulation of power, not quite as much as, let's say, I don't know, Taiwan does, but it looks very, very threatening. And I think, to speak of, let's say, NATO, where countries have committed to die for each other in conflict, with the very loose, sort of confederation, or, that is occasionally pooling some resources together as BRICS is not appropriate. And I really don't see the signs, so here's the thing. So it's not as if, and like you, I mourn, a good old day of, capital flows going to the most productive places and so on and so forth. But frankly, I mean, the green transition was screwed before Russia attacked Ukraine, right? The funding was nowhere to be seen. We have been over-promising and under-delivering with the order of difference magnitude between the promises and the actions, right? Year after year after year, again and again. And I don't yet see any evidence that the frictions or the bifurcation into a dollar versus RMB system is contributing additionally to undermining the green transition, right? So I can see that there are serious, very serious problems. And, in fact, I think it's already too late for 1.5 degrees. So I'm one step beyond you. We must strive for 1.6 or 1.7, but we don't even have 10 years, right? I mean, we should have done this stuff 10 years back. But I don't see the sanctions as, more than a marginal contributor to the bigger problems of the lack of transition finance.
Franklin, do you want to comment on that? Because I know you have been thinking of quite a bit about this. And then I want to turn to Sony, Kerry, because I kind of want to pick up Sony's point about finance with you. Franklin.
Thank you, Rodney. So coming back also to your question about does the geopolitical split, and I'm not saying that's a split between North and South, it's a split between Russia and I wouldn't even say NATO, Russia and a coalition which involves the US, North America, the EU, Japan, Korea, Australia. It's a global coalition, and I don't think that automatically or necessarily leads to the same kind of fragmentation in the international financial system that I think is inevitable in the geopolitical order. Coming to Mona's point, essentially about the weaponization of the financial system, and I think bracketing entirely for now the questions about the efficacy, the tactics, the strategy, and even the morality of sanctions. And on this, I'm actually fully aligned with Sony. I think the big question is, essentially, what else could the West have done to effectively try to revert to the international legal norm in this context, which wouldn't sort of involve weaponization of the international financial system. And I guess the third point would be, that genie is out of the box, right? I mean, the countries that have imposed sanctions on the Russian Federation, and particularly with the freezing of the Russian central banks, forex reserves abroad, have really opened up an entirely new world when it comes to kind of financial warfare. And that genie is not, I think, ever going to get back in the box. So to me, the key question, and I would love to hear Sony's views on this, is how does the Global South respond in that context to the kind of perennial risk that the statecraft can be kind of constrained by the threat of financial weaponization against their own domestic economies? And is it, as I particularly fear, that we might see the kind of creation of a ruble, renminbi, rupee currency area around energy and commodities, and the implications of that for the broader financial system? I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Franklin. There's an interesting question on that. Has in the chat, somebody has said, what the effectively, if sanctions are removed, what is the weapon that Western democracies have, given that they are unwilling to use aircraft and tanks in Ukrainian space? And I'm really struck then by a phrase that you used earlier, Mona, about the weaponization of climate politics. And it is I'm wondering to what extent where we are now actually means that we have, we are now using proxies. And potentially the climate could be a proxy, the dollar could be a proxy, the climate could be a proxy. This is an alarming prospect for us. Maybe you might come back to that, but I am really keen to hear from you, Kerry, now, and your reflections on this and where you would like to take us.
Yeah, a couple of further thoughts. Appreciate the conversation. Let's just talk about the US for a second in the context of all of this. The US became the world's largest oil and gas producer over the last decade or so. That doesn't seem to have completely penetrated people's minds who are navigating the space. That's one thing. Another thing, of course, is we have 2 election cycles coming here. So it's fine for John Kerry to show up, and he's great. He's fantastic. He spoke to my class in 2019 at Yale, and said there was nothing more important than getting the US and China together to invest in accelerating take-up of renewable energy in the developing world, was prior to his current role. I'd love to see that happen. I'm sure he would too. But we have election cycles coming up in the fall and again in 2 years. And if you're outside the US, do you really have confidence in what the US will do going forward? And what does that mean for the geopolitical landscape? I have a lot of questions. I think there's a danger of oversimplification that's been playing out in this landscape and in these conversations. Not this one, but in general, assumptions that the EU can meaningfully lead the way, being something like 20% of the global economy or whatever it is. Again, it's the 80-20 rule. The G7, like, why is there a G7? What does that even mean? With election cycles coming in the US, I showed up in Milan to a 2017 G7 event because there was no one else to come, and during the transition, and it all felt a bit silly. So, what do these existing coalitions mean? What is really effective? And I'm taken by the phrase, the new coalition of the willing that needs to be built, perhaps not from scratch, but using the existing coalitions and to stop the us and them conversations and get down to what we really need to do. And that coalition is everywhere already. It's in every country. And I think we have to stop demonizing countries, and because with people in Russia and China, in Indonesia, in India, as was said earlier, why is the West pointing fingers at India, or why are they not pointing fingers at Israel? Basically, has the same stance as India when it comes to Russian oil. There just seems to be a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of finger pointing, and I think we all start with finger pointing when we see something we don't like, but we have to move to solutions from finger pointing as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Kerry. Interesting reflection that the state is only one manifestation of where where the willingness and unwillingness emerges. It also, as in federal states like the US, California is a leader, absolute leader on this, and we know within the European Union there are leaders and laggards. Mona, I feel I should come back to you, partly because I'm still interested in your weaponizing, your busy work in the background, weaponizing climate politics, but just your reflections on what you've heard.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to qualify what I said, sanctions should be removed. I think we need to de-escalate the sanctions regime and extract political concessions from Russia. And this is nuanced, complex work. We do have an energy crunch, particularly you guys in Europe are feeling it way more than we are in the US. And this could be a time for diplomacy. I mean, why isn't that a channel that's, being drawn down further? Instead, the United States is trying to pull, MBS into the picture, like phone calls to MBS, Macron's calling MBS, Biden's calling MBS. So there are ways to stabilize the energy crunch that is destabilizing energy markets in the global economy. But I also think, and others have mentioned this, that this moment where the weaponization of climate politics that we've landed in is gonna fuel a green transition. It's certainly gonna do that in Europe, and it's gonna be doing that in the United States, hopefully as well. Again, Franklin, this is a point that you raised, that right now we're in such a tenuous space that we don't know how it's gonna, how it's gonna pan out. So we might have a huge expansion in, LNG terminals and pipelines, the Canadians building pipelines after committing to net zero. So this opens up a whole Pandora's box of places we don't want to go. Those are different things we can talk about. I did, there's a question somebody asked, Kerry, perhaps you or Franklin, to Sony, about this ruble, renminbi, rupee area. And, part of the way that history has transformed itself over the last 4 months, decades made in 4 months, is the doubling down of institutions such as the AIIB, the New Development Bank. We've already have China's alternative to the SWIFT network, and we're seeing, the G7 having to respond by saying we're going to promise poorer countries 600 billion to match the 1.1 trillion in the Belt and Road Initiative. The EU has promised 300 billion by 2027 for their new partnership, right, for global infrastructure and investment. So their promises have been made, right? The capital isn't quite there. How are we gonna square, this circle is my question.
So in just building on that then, and in response to the for instance, question asked in the chat about, will the invasion accelerate a transition? I mean, it's almost like you are saying, well, it could, or it couldn't. It's that there were like two opposing forces here, and I'm wondering people, what are the things that might pull those forces together? One of which is this question of, well, is there money there? So you have Global Gateway, you have the G7 partnership, etc. But go back to what Kerry said earlier about, yeah, but like there isn't the money there. And then the second angle is one that Alden Mayer raised in the chat, where sorry, let me just make sure I have Alden's comment here, which is about the functioning of the G20. I mean, G20 is child of a previous crisis. Indonesia is, in climate terms, looks like it wants to do the right thing, but obviously has its own issues to deal with. And it's got the Sustainable Finance Working Group and other G20 mechanisms that Alden is mentioning. So to what extent could we then take in the next few minutes of this, think a bit about is there an alternative venue? Could G20 be, if it's not the BRICS, could G20 help us come down on the right side of that dilemma that you've kind of characterized? And then secondly, could we follow Kerry's set of questions about, yeah, but there is no money, and there hasn't been money for a long time. So we can take either of those in turn. We will cover both, I assure you. I'd like to come back in either of those.
May I go first?
Yes, please, Sonny.
Well, first, the quick sort of response back. So, there is nothing wrong with the emergence of, multipolar currencies. I'm not saying we're anywhere close to that. I mean, the dollar remains far and away the most dominant one, and there is no sign that is set to decline anytime, in the near foreseeable future. But yeah, I mean, macroeconomically speaking, it's okay, and geopolitically speaking, it may even be better, right? And I think we all remember the famous US phrase about the dictator of DRC. He may be a bastard, but he's our bastard, right? I mean, historically, great power competition, one could say, if one were to read, a more optimistic version of sort of what happened in history, did fuel, Russia, the USSR versus the US, going and coming with arms, with aid, with money, with infrastructure, right? And we did see some of that because the Global Gateway and, the new US package, I mean, these are new names, but discussion about, a rival to the Belt and Road Initiative, and China is coming in as a rival to the World Bank, which is dominated by the US and the EU, etc. Right? I mean, that has been around for like the longest time, 2-3 decades, and so the need, the shortage of resources is so big, and the scale and speed of investment needs are so large that every possible source of funding, is welcome. And to the extent a new emergent great power competition or rivalry might drive an escalation upward spiral of promises, provided that they are actually followed by real commitments, right? I mean, not just hollow promises like we've been seeing. It may be no bad thing. And I think there is something to be said about what I think Mona alluded to, which is there is clearly an efficiency loss in macroeconomic terms in a global financial system that is, let's say, bifurcated. There are, 2-3 competitive settlement mechanisms. There are frictions across, major dominant currency zones, etc. But I think, in this particular discussion we are having, that may be more than offset by the competitive pressure to stay relevant and influential, right? I mean, China is now the largest trading partner of far more countries than the United States. And, I remember growing up, no matter which country you looked at, I mean, with 1 or 2 exceptions, the US was by far away the dominant trading partner. But I mean, just let me end on a tiny note of skepticism. That is the global gateway and the new US promises. I mean, this illusion that the public sector is going to snap, it's going to put $1 billion on and trillions are going to be mobilized by BlackRock. I mean, that ain't happening, right? I mean, billions to trillions has failed on all evidence, and yet it continues to be the only game in town, and we continue to throw around the word leverage, right? And that ain't happening. And last but not the least, if we thought that, Western financing for emerging economy transitions was not forthcoming in the heyday of finance, with markets rising by 10, 20% year after year, interest rates at record lows, assets under management at record high, amazingly relaxed financial conditions, what makes us think that these same economies will prioritize this funding over domestic allocation under stressed fiscal circumstances, upset macroeconomic policies, likely recessions, and AUMs and private financial assets that have, within this year shrunk by about 25%? It ain't happening.
So the really good point, Sony. I'm going to ask Kerry then to reflect back on that, and I would say that there was something that you said in your conversation, Gary, where you talked about the money just wasn't there, and yet I would have to say, since I came into Climate World in the last few years, I have been told that there is a wall of money that is waiting to, I'm not quite sure what a wall is supposed to do. I have an awful feeling if it falls down, it's a bad thing, but it's just like waiting to go. All somebody has to say is go. And Kerry, you're disappointing me. Where is my wall of money?
I feel like a weatherman who's about to tell you that it's going to rain and everyone will hate me. But no, thanks for that. It's really, really important, I think, to make sure everyone understands the nature of the financial system in this regard. We did a paper called The Value of Everything prior to the book that was called The Value of Everything for the UNEP inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system, which we updated in 2020. We approximated the value of global assets that are tradable at around 500 trillion US dollars. And about half of that's in the real economy, and about half of that is in the hands of or overseen by financial institutions, a much larger number than you tend to see cited by the likes of McKinsey and so on. It's deployed in different asset classes. There is a lot of dry powder sitting in the hands of private equity and venture capital managers. So there is some money there in different pockets, as Mona was also describing, but there isn't this $50 trillion just waiting to be spent on the low carbon transition. That isn't there. There's a lot of activity in climate tech VC. There's a lot of activity, obviously, in different markets. But asset owners, pension funds, university endowments, foundations, sovereign wealth funds, they manage what, 50 to 60 trillion US dollars or thereabouts. They all have beneficiaries. None of them have large amounts of money just sitting around waiting to be deployed. It's like, where is the capital going to come from? is the question. It's not that 50 trillion is simply not just sitting there, and it's important, I think, which is why we did the paper and the analysis, that more people kind of reflect on the nature of the financial system. Where is capital deployed? Where is it available? It's not sitting around in Indonesia waiting to finance its critical transition, where coal is the cheapest option, and so on. The last thing to say perhaps on this is that in recent years, the US has risen up and has something like 60% of market value, and 40% of the S&P 500 is in technology. The S&P 500 is largely decarbonized, actually. It's only 20% industrial and energy up until this year. So we can anticipate and encourage markets to develop and to decarbonize naturally through the rise of their economic well-being. There's a direct correlation between countries able to respond to the low carbon transition paradigm and their economic wherewithal. If a country doesn't have economic strength, they're not going to transition, as Sony was saying. So I think we need to be serious about what success looks like and what the nature of the financial system really is. And as a result, the money is not there. And we're almost certainly going to have to get more creative when it comes to creating that necessary capital for the transition that needs to be deployed everywhere around the world. And we have to stop sort of pretending otherwise.
Okay, so thinking hats on, folks, because in a few minutes I'm going to ask everybody for their one creative idea. And can I ask the participants and those of you tuned into this, don't forget, keep asking questions, but B, your one creative idea in the chat, please, would be really helpful. Okay, who wants to take it from where Kerry has brought us then with this like, let's get real about the system. Let's get real, and then going back to the, if you like, the premise of this, which is that get rid about the system in an unstable context. What does that mean for those of us who actually want to solve this problem?
So I'll jump in there because I haven't come in for a moment, and I think hopefully this will respond to a certain extent to Alden's question about the G20, but also to Mona's point about the urgency of the moment. And that is to say that, notwithstanding my concerns about the kind of coherence of the international financial system, I do think that climate finance has such an overwhelming imperative to it that it can be the mechanism, the vehicle to retaining sufficient international collaboration and cooperation when it comes to development finance and climate finance, to avoid the kind of the worst fragmentation that is, in the potential range. And so I think very simply of what is the international financial system. The international financial system is a set of norms, rules, and institutions that facilitate transfer of value, transfer of capital. And insofar as those rules and institutions for climate finance are sufficiently valued and important and significant in political and geopolitical terms, that they can sort of survive through this potential geopolitical fragmentation, then in the end, climate finance may be the thing that saves us, as it were, from the world becoming even more divided than it currently is on its trajectory to become.
Thanks, Frank. Does that also then speak to Sony's point that there's nothing wrong with having a competition, provided it takes you up, as opposed to it takes you down?
Yes, but I sort of always frame this in the geopolitical divisions of the Cold War, in particular the position of the non-aligned movement within it, and the pressure on a lot of the non-aligned movement to join a side. And so the concern I have is that if we start to see this competitive to sort of, whether it's currency-based or trade-based, whatever it might be, financial systems, then competing for trying to pressurize third countries to either join one or the other, then that's going to drive a lot of very bad politics. And I think that applies to the big economies as well as the small.
Thanks, Franklin. Mona, I was going to turn to you at this stage then, and in that context of the nature of and potential for activating one or more financial systems. What are your reflections?
So, yeah, I think this moment that we're in, we've seen a transformation of global finance in terms of new institutions, such as the IMF's Resilience and Sustainability Trust, that is specifically devoted to climate adaptation and mitigation. Now, there's not a lot of funds out there, but we do have $550 billion that is being hoarded by advanced economies, right? The new SDR issuance. Why not give all of that to the global south through these climate debt swaps, where you forgive countries' debts, right? We know the debt burden in the global south is terribly bad. It's about 60% of countries in the developing world facing or in debt crisis, right? So why not link up some kind of debt forgiveness with climate infrastructure? And those plans have been around for at least two plus years post 2020. So we have this new financing mechanism. Why not use it? Why not leverage the public financing, $550 billion, with private, the wall of cash that is, willing to step up? I want to talk about the competitive dynamics. I think they can be productive, but then they can also be dangerous. What about this dynamic between the European Union, thinking of where the money is in the global economy, and the United States? If we can channel that, right, promises made by the EU, the 300 billion, versus the promise made by the US, which is 600 billion. Why not engage with some of that, competitive desire to look good with respect to the non-aligned nations? But I will leave that conversation to others to add to.
May I come in on a positive note for a change? So this is negative and positive, right? So I think the world is dramatically underestimating the physical risks of climate change and how quickly they're coming at us. And I say this as someone who's scientifically trained and has at least some understanding of climate models. Second, the world has massive, so there is this idea that still prevails, and a phrase we keep using, including, the NGFS scenarios, etc., a smooth and orderly transition versus a disorderly transition, right? I mean, if for those of us who might still think in those terms, I have news. We are in the middle of a chaotic, disorderly transition, and the time to have started a smooth, orderly transition was, 20 years back, 10 years back, right? So it's too late for any idea of a orderly transition. The transition will be messy. It'll be full of supply chain shocks, bottlenecks. It'll be full of, maybe false promises of technology, financial issues, stranded assets. And it's going to have large macroeconomic, large distributive consequences. And in fact, in the work I'm currently doing at the EUI, I'm hoping to be able to show that either the physical impact of climate change or a sincere effort to mitigate either of those will become a large, perhaps the biggest secular driver of macroeconomic variables in the global economy in the next decade or two, at par or perhaps even more important than demographic trends and such like. So that is the work we're doing. So if this is true, right, then a good way of thinking about this is, here we are in our petty disputes, China, US, global competition about, I don't know, some intellectual property here and there, or, trade secrets or whatever, right? and we do have the equivalent of an external existential threat that now at least, every country has woken up to. And there, I think in some ways, the Chinese take climate change far more seriously than many nations in the West do. And India will face much worse consequences from the physical impact, right? So India has a very strong incentive to take climate change seriously. So if climate is as big a problem as I think it is, right, then it will help focus minds. And that is uniquely a problem where competition versus cooperation has only one sensible strategy, and that is cooperation, right? It's either all large macro significant countries are in this together, or the shit is going to hit the fan. And there are no two ways around it. So so that might be a blessing in disguise, that the climate problem is far more macroeconomically, financially, and from a physical risk perspective serious than is generally recognized. And as that recognition comes, then that will focus minds and help drive cooperation even between sworn rivals and enemies.
I think one of the productive elements of this new disorder that we're in is the recognition that these axes of the climate, security, and debt, they're connected, and they're problems that we need to deal with now, and it can't wait. I would love to know how we get to your scenario where climate becomes the green engine for global growth. How do we get from here to there, Sunny? I'll leave that up to you in your paper.
Just to throw in that only for Sony could be, we're really screwed, be good news.
I suppose the kind of importance then is of actually being able to model this. So one of the points that I have often made is that who would have thunk that a relatively small bank not being able to move its cash around in September 2008 would do what it did? And of course, the reason it did was because it was sitting on a whole lot of other banks that couldn't do the same thing. And that's a macroeconomic crisis. And I've been trying to then think, so how, what's your physical lever that does this at this level? Bearing in mind, and I'm very aware as I'm saying this, that Sony, you are sitting there in Delhi, and India has, and Pakistan have been going through the most horrendous heat wave. The city in Pakistan became the hottest place the world has ever seen recently. So this is absolutely horrendous. But let's face it, guys, the US and the European Union are rich, and we can deal with an awful lot of these things in a way other people can't. And so it's almost like part of the urgency to me is to demonstrate that systemic macroeconomic problem, because it actually is, I think we feel it, but it is not in the models. And as we all know, if theory doesn't tell us, it ain't gonna happen. So I think that's a really, the work you do there is so important. And then I would relate that back to the, Kerry, that you're thinking about that money. And then how does that flow? And of course, it's not just rich country money. I'm also really keen on how developing country financial markets, which are really important here, can make it. And so that you actually make the growth work properly. And Mona, we shouldn't forget something that you said so much earlier that's really struck in my mind. The poor people of the world are facing multiple crises. And actually, they're the ones in the crosshairs of, whatever we weaponize. Either rich people or great powers weaponize. It is the ordinary folks that you talked about, that Kerry's talked about. They're the ones that are going to happen. Okay, we're not going to end this on a low note. This is not going to be a hopeless conversation. Please, you and all our attendees, let's start thinking, what is there a move? Is there a thing you would like to see? Maybe you've mentioned it already. Just bring it back out again. What could we bring as a group here in terms of messages of hope, things that you can see might make a shift, or the one thing I would love to see is, who would like to throw one in first?
I can start if it's helpful.
Please do, Kerry. That would be great.
Yeah, no, this has been a great conversation. Thanks for having me. I think maybe one last thought, that during the pandemic, I think we learned that we can print money and it won't necessarily negatively affect economies. Certainly in the UK, people were paid not to work. And I'd like to think that something like that could be scaled. It could be global. I think it needs to be. And to achieve that, we kind of need to have some sort of new infrastructure and not rely on existing organizations to figure out how that could actually work to bridge this gap. When people talk about, Thomas Piketty talks about in his million copies sold book, that the solution is to tax the wealthy. Well, good luck with that. But one thing we could do is to devalue the nature of current assets by printing more money for the purpose of the transition. So I'd like to see more thinking along those lines.
Thank you, Kerry.
Can I pick up on I think the really important point that Mona made earlier about incentives and about debt. And I wish I could claim credit for this, but as Ronan will know, one of our colleagues has been thinking a lot about the underlying sort of political drivers of the UNFCCC process, and has proposed a new grand bargain to replace the one that was originally struck at Paris between the North and the South in terms of financing, which revolves around the treatment of the debt problem, in debt forgiveness, debt repayment, whatever it might be, in exchange for X, whatever it might be on the part of the North. And I think that is really essential, particularly at this juncture, to reinvigorate the power of the multilateral process within the UNFCCC. I think there are also significant barriers and challenges to that, not least the fact that China and private investors actually hold such a large proportion of emerging market debt now. So, but that kind of goes back to our original question, is about how do we sort of avoid this fragmentation? And part of that is going to be about bringing China and the private debtors and the private finance sector more broadly into the picture in a kind of very meaningful way, to ultimately use the power, both financial and political, of the North to direct that finance in a way which is going to be impactful in the short and medium term.
Should I go next? All right. So I want to end on a positive note. So I think one of the interesting developments has been the new RMB liquidity pool at the Bank for International Settlements. And I think we're talking about ways of financing the transition. Kerry, you mentioned more MMT style policies. That's going to be fraught given the inflationary environment we're in right now. For sure, debt forgiveness, Franklin, is going to be crucial. And I think new modalities of financing, such as central bank digital currencies, and if the BIS, which is outside of the US, can support this, that would be fantastic. So in a big way, a push for more monetary plurality that doesn't only involve dollars and euros would be a good thing.
Is it my turn? Right. So one quick note of caution and then a different grand bargain. So the note of caution is, I know, I've participated in far too many debt restructurings. And one note of caution from that experience is, there's a reason those debts are up for restructuring, because they are not payable, right? And that means that even with cancellation or forgiveness or whatever term you use, that it is not going to free up a whole lot of cash that was otherwise available, right? So I think, George Monbiot and a lot of the commentators on that vastly overestimate how much cash will be made available, even if there were to be a fantastically generous, cancellation of all existing low-income country debt, right? It would probably get us into financing, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 years worth of the green transition investments needed, but no more, right? So at best, it is an order of magnitude lower than the financing gap we are looking at. And so let's not, undersell ourselves and settle for what looks like a very lopsided grand bargain. A different grand bargain, which I think is necessary. So I'm not saying it's likely, but it's necessary, is as follows, right? So you've all heard the statistic of how much cement China used. China used more concrete in 3 years than the United States did in the entire last century, right? Chinese per capita emissions are now greater than EU per capita emissions at income levels that are a fraction of that of the EU, right? Now, that remains the only tried and tested development model, large-scale domestic physical infrastructure, huge negative environmental footprint, not just climate, but soil erosion, ocean acidification, and what have you, every single environmental parameter that is flashing red. And this goes back to the earlier point I made, right? Which is we must applaud the Indians for our, let's say, and I was born in India. I'm not Indian, but let's say our incompetence, because I don't want to annoy anybody, at our failure to track the Chinese growth trajectory more closely, right? So it's not that we didn't want to. I mean, India was desperate to grow as fast as China, but we are many, many years behind, several decades behind, right? And the world must thank us for that, because that is the only reason we are not already way over 1.5 degrees. It is the only reason we might have a modicum of tiny possibility to save biodiversity, limit ocean acidification, repair soil erosion, right? And to think that if Africa then, the same population as India, chose to go down the same pathway, right? So we need a new development model, and we need the financing from the West to incentivize that and the technological transfer. And here is one of the few amazingly positive impacts of COVID. It has normalized the conversation we are having. In the pre-COVID world, this would be an event in London in a grand hotel, and here we are on Zoom, and there is no reason that McKinsey partners, Goldman partners, government officials, all high value added services we think about, not just back office stuff, shouldn't and can't be done remotely. So a new model where trade in goods and large-scale physical infrastructure is replaced by a decentralized model that focuses on human capital, remote delivery, high value-added services, will allow catch-up growth of the kind that China demonstrated for countries like India and countries in Africa at a fraction of the environmental footprint. And frankly, arithmetically, that is the only way forward, because we can't go finger pointing at India and saying, sorry, too bad, you cannot expect a better future for your children because we used up all the environmental space, right? So to reconcile economic growth and catch up with environmental boundaries that are flashing yellow and red, we need a new development model. And part of the answer lies in this cross-border trade and services and focus on human capital development and away from large-scale physical infrastructure and vanity projects.
Tony, thank you so much for bringing us to a close on a high. I was worried you were about to force India to recess, not develop, but in fact you swung it around, and I think you have given us that there is a growth model. Mona, your monetary plurality. Franklin, you're thinking about grand bargains and what we can do with debt and how that contributes, and Kerry, let's learn from what we've done in COVID in terms of state intervention, effectively printing money and that. that does, I think, give me hope, and I hope it gives our attendees hope for what we can do in the future. Thank you, the four of you, for being like an amazing bunch of people to have this conversation with. I hope we can have it again, and I hope we can take some actions out of this and move things forward. So thank you to Delaney and to Julia, who've been in the background, just keeping this thing flowing so smoothly, and to everybody for joining. Have a wonderful